All right. Well, hey guys, welcome to this edition of Real Live Talk. I hope that the content today blesses you, challenges you, makes you think, or somehow adds value to your life. And join me in welcoming my guest for today. Brian Sanders is the founder and former executive director of the Underground Network, which is an international fellowship of microchurch incubators creating city based ecosystems of faith, creativity, and empowered social enterprise. As a social entrepreneur, Brian has helped hundreds of missionary enterprises around the world, including churches, businesses, and nonprofits. He's also written some books that we'll talk about today on the podcast, and those books include Microchurches and I believe his newest book, The 6 Seasons of Calling. Brian, thanks for joining me today, my friend. It's really a privilege to meet you, first of all, and an honor to chat with you today. So welcome to Real Life Talk.
Thanks, man. I just want you to know I couldn't hear a word you were saying just now. I was like totally muted, and I was like, "Oh, what's going on?" And then as soon as I switched the speaker and I could hear you, was the end of my bio. So I'm very delighted to have missed my own bio. That's not something
Good.
you really want to hear twice,
Good.
Anyway,
Yeah, no, I
perfect
get
timing.
it. I get it. And there's times where I just kind of start into the conversation because I feel like that whole part at the beginning is a little bit awkward where I'm talking about you and you're right there. And I don't really love it. It's not my favorite thing. But yeah, sometimes when I'm talking with
Part of
someone
it.
who I'm just meeting for the first time, I like to
Understandable.
show
Of
the honor
course.
by
Of
doing the
course.
bio.
Yeah.
But yeah. So that's cool. That works for me that you couldn't hear it. That's super
It
cool.
could be
Well,
it
how are
could
you
be
doing
like a
today, man?
pro tip. It could be a pro tip for the future. Just mute during the bio and then come in at the end. Anyway.
I love it. Or I could do one of these numbers where it's just me on the screen
There you
and
go.
then I bring you up. I could get all fancy with it and stuff like that, but I always forget. I always forget to
Skills.
use the features that I have. But anyway, man, yeah, thanks for joining me. And just how are you? How are you? How's life? How's the family? What's going on?
Yeah, good. We have a lot of things going on, a lot of projects, so that probably is my happiest. When I feel um, that energy, a lot of cool things happening, and God
Yeah.
is in that stuff. Not that it's not good to also do nothing sometimes, but I'm probably not great at that. So yeah, I'm well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like I'm not very good at not doing anything either. I get that completely. Well, I gave a kind of a very brief synopsis, which you couldn't hear, which again is cool, of who you are and what you do and stuff like that. But I'd love to kind of hear from you a little bit about what you're doing currently, and then I'd like to kind of back up and talk a little bit more about the underground and the concept of the microchurch. And I'm really, really fascinated about this personally as a church planter. Currently, I'm involved in different levels, different capacities, but involved in a few different church plants right now. And particularly my family and I were moving to a new city within the next 30 days or so to really begin a new church plant in the Houston area. And so I've been a lot of the stuff that I've been reading about in your writing are things that are really resonating with me on a personal level. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today. But before we kind of jump into some of the specifics on that, I'd love if you could just share a brief synopsis, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Um, sure. Yeah. I mean, right now, so since leaving my kind of role with the underground, of course, I'm still part of the underground. I still sit on the board. I still lead a microchurch. Um, I still am a vital part of the community here. But of course, the underground's become this bigger network of friends and sister movements around the world. But leaving that maybe to a younger team and entrusting, so that whole process of like founder syndrome and letting go, and that how actually wonderful and healthy and beautiful that whole process can be. And then for me, I think there's sort of three big meta skills for the 21st century leader, and one of them is collaboration. Is actually, I feel like, a part of the economy. You could look at like after World War II, you have what could be called the producer economy in an industrial age, and then into like the 70s, 80s, what Paul Sappho has called a consumer economy, which
Mm,
gives way, he says, in 2007 to a creator economy. People want to make something now. They don't just want to buy
right.
stuff. They want to define themselves by what they make. But I would say that we're quickly moving into what I would call collaboration economy. So this is maybe coming or on its way, or we're on the kind of threshold or precipice of. So I think I always want to be there. I always want to be maybe a couple of steps ahead. And so I've taken a role with the National Christian Foundation to help specialize really in collective impact, cross organizational collaboration. How do we get 50 organizations in a city come like dealing with the same stage social problem, like homelessness or
Mm,
foster care and adoption or anti-human trafficking or something like that. Get them all to actually work from the same plan, raise money together, trust each other, create complex strategy together, stuff like that. So to me, it feels like a cutting edge thing. So I'm working with the foundation doing that. And then I also have a big stake working in just a co-working company that's going national called Cohatch, which is this beautiful little ecosystem of collaboration, and they just build incredibly beautiful spaces. So I'm helping them come into Florida, and I see a lot of overlap between decentralized church planting, which I know we'll probably talk about,
mm.
microchurches, and businesses like that who create mixed economy spaces where you have people of faith, people that don't have faith, for profit, not for profit, all
Mm.
kind of colliding with each other, working together, working side by side. I really love that idea. So I'm working pretty closely in helping that company come into Florida. So those are the two big projects I'm working on now.
That's incredible. What you're talking about there with the sort of bridging those gaps or creating those bridges between different kinds of social enterprise and things of that nature, right? You're talking about connecting people and resources and things of that nature. That sounds incredible. It also sounds incredibly challenging. I would imagine that. I mean, what does that look like? If you can, I'm sure that's probably a hard question to answer because I'm sure it's different in different scenarios. But if you can just kind of give an idea of what that kind of looks like as far as how you even start to have those, is it having conversations with leaders and boards and stuff like that? Or what does it look like as far as even just getting the ball rolling on kind of creating some of those bridges?
Yeah, and you're right. It is hard. That's why people don't do it. I also think, or when we try it, it usually doesn't work. It usually
Right.
fails in some way.
Right.
Or our attempt is just too pedestrian. We just say, let's just get together and pray once a year or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like to really actually pull in the same direction to share resources that requires a level of trust and communication we're just not familiar with, because the truth is, a 20th century motif approach to leadership is really about built on the idea of competition and empire building, and what Chan Kim would call red oceans, like it's just full of blood. So it's like contested market space. So even churches coming into a city or something like that, it's like, do they really see other churches as their co-belligerents in some greater cause,
Mm,
or actually are they kind of competition? And nobody would say that. No one really deep in their heart feels that or theologically is committed to the idea that another church is my competitor, but they are. If you think like a consumer, if you think like a marketeer, right? You're thinking
mm-hmm.
this is contested market. We're all going for the same people. So you have to break that down. I mean, somehow you've got to get to people's deeper core idea, that why am I doing this? Like for the kingdom of God, or for orphans, or to end trafficking, or for the cause of life, or whatever the cause is, where people actually deep down, the reason why they got into it was to solve some impossible problem. But you're 20 years in, 10 years in, 30 years in, and you just realize we're never gonna our organization is never gonna solve this problem, which is enough to me. I'm discovering as another sort of condition that has to exist before collaboration is possible, which is people have to come to the point where they realize we cannot do this on our own. And that
Mm.
can take some time too, because we are full of pride and hubris, and we've been told this great man myth that you're going to start, like you're going to start a church and it's going to reach the whole city, or you're going to start an agency and it's going to solve this problem. That's how we raise money.
Yeah.
We recruit staff. That's what we actually believe. Like, you're young enough to think we'll be the ones that finally crack this code and solve this problem. And of course, if you go at it long enough, you finally come to the point and you go, and you don't quit. So you stay at it long enough. You're still in the game, but you go, there's just no way. Those are the people
Mm.
that will come to the table.
Mm.
And then you need a neutral convener. You need somebody who isn't one of those players. So the National Christian Foundation is a great convener for that, because we don't do any of those things. And money. So if you can have a lead giver, I think that's another factor. If you can have like a philanthropist that's involved early on, that's saying, I wanna help solve the problem. I wanna put serious money behind collaboration. And if you guys will
Mm.
work together and you'll come up with a great idea, I'll back it, with money. That helps a lot. That
Sure.
helps get people in the room and gets people moving. So there's a lot of little, parts of the recipe, I guess.
Wow. Some of those things that you mentioned, like you mentioned specifically human trafficking, you mentioned adoption and foster care, which right now in our coming years is it's already a huge problem. Over 500,000 kids in our foster care system. The last number that I heard from a friend of mine who's very much involved in advocacy for foster care and things like that. It's somewhere in the ballpark of 125,000 kids that are in the foster care system that are completely approved for adoption, that are cleared for adoption. And with with the law that was recently passed, or the turning back of Roe versus Wade, it seems to me like in the coming decade or so, that assuming things stay the way that they are, that our adoption system, foster care system in this country is going to be bursting at the seams in an even greater way. And I've been thinking about this so much, like, if anybody needs to get involved and to help with this and not be in a position of pointing fingers and, oh, you shouldn't have done that and blah blah blah, it needs to be the church. I feel like leading, and the capital C church, the people of God, leading this charge on, let's come around our communities and our societies, embrace our communities, embrace people, right? Like, embrace individuals, and find a way to, as you're saying, collaborate together, find creative ways, creative solutions where we can collaborate together to actually make an impact, where we're not just preaching about it, we're not just talking about it. I feel like, what you said there about, like, okay, we're going to get together once a year and we're going to pray together and we're going to do that. And we kind of do these things that make us feel like we're checking some kind of a box. But when it comes to these major social issues like human trafficking and foster care and adoption, and I would put in there addiction, and I would put in there mental health, and there's a lot of things that are really plaguing people today, in really, in the case of human trafficking, really really sinister ways, that I don't think we talk about it enough. And very very much less, I don't think we actually find ways to actually get involved, like grassroots, like, let's do something, let's just collaborate and do something about this. That's something that it's it's constantly in my mind. I'm constantly thinking about it, and I don't always know what to do. I don't always know how to respond. And I think what you're saying there, that this piece of collaborating together, is really essential if we're going to actually see breakthrough in these areas, and not just put little band-aids, and not just talk about how we can do, or we should be doing, or let's do something, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, almost like, I feel like a lot of times with these conversations that are really really important, and I don't know what you think, and I, do you feel like that's accurate, that it should be the church, in terms of, it should be the people of God kind of being the solution to these challenges that we see? Not in opposition to maybe
Of
secular
course.
groups or
Yeah, of
governments or
course.
anything like that, but the people of God kind of coming around and embracing our communities in this way, where we're willing to collaborate with others and things like that. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question or if I'm rambling, but
No, yeah, I understand. So I just completed like what was a 12-month process with three different alliance teams, like the creme de la creme, the best thinkers within
Yeah.
those communities, to do what we have called like a complex plan. So essentially, you can't just, it's not like an organizational strategic plan where you say what can our church, our organization, our company do in the next 3 to 5 years. If you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to like end human trafficking, there's not one pathway. You have to deal with like a lot of conflating issues, right? A lot of conflating social issues. That's what makes a problem complex.
Yes.
So what we did was essentially say, one of the first things you try to figure out is what are all the forces and factors contributing to this current condition.
Mm.
And so you have to pull all that apart. So we're talking like 400 man hours per plan, right? So it's a lot of work, it's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of focus groups, it's a lot of kind of consolidating ideas. And
Mm.
in the end, you come up with these. Each community came up with like 6 to 7, 5 to 7 kind of contributing factors. Like these are the massive contributing factors to why this problem exists. And if we wanted to change the problem, we'd have to address them all, right? All these contributing factors.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we do is we sequence them. So we say, okay, which would you deal with first? Which would you deal with second? Which would you deal with third, right? All three of these, so foster care and adoption, anti-human trafficking, and the pro-life kind of
Mm.
community, pregnancy medical centers, those kind of folks, all of them identified as a key contributing factor to why this problem exists was the disengagement of the church. and then
Mm.
and then interestingly
Wow.
enough, they all said that the first thing we should deal with is the church. So disconnected from each other. They didn't know, none of them were involved in any other
Wow.
than the one process they were a part of, and they all came to the conclusion that actually the first thing we would put money in, the first thing we would want to create collaboration around, the first problem we would have to solve is like the inactivity of the church around this issue. so
Wow.
so
Wow.
all I'm saying is that's obviously not a huge sample size, but it's a profound discovery for me
Result. Yeah. Yeah.
that we see the church in our deepest hopes, in our like dreams for the world, as something really powerful, really important,
Mm.
really like a lever somehow that moves the world, a lever long enough that can move any problem. And yet we have this deep sense of disappointment about it, that we're all managing in our own psyche, that it isn't there. It isn't what it should be. It
Mm.
isn't what it could be. But we all know that if there ever was going to be an end to certain kinds of social evils, the church it feels like the church would have to be a part of it. Now,
Right.
maybe not. Maybe there's other ways around it. But all to say, I think you might be right. And of course, when we think about this sort of parallel discussion about microchurches and decentralized church and giving the church back to ordinary people, to me that's the idea, is that
Yeah.
to wake that sleeping giant. It's not just engaging these sort of big churches with larger than life leaders and getting
Mm-hmm.
them engaged in the problem, but it's like actually waking up the rank and file, the lay
Yeah.
normal person.
Wow. You made a statement in your book, Microchurches, and this might not be verbatim, but I think I'm capturing the heart of what you were getting at. And it's that we have to stop looking at the church as something for people to be invited into, and instead to look at the church, to look at the people of God as something that is, you said, blessed to be broken and given to the world. Could you, because I feel like this connects, and this is kind of a good segue into the conversation on microchurch and things like that. But I feel like this really connects and embodies a lot of what you're saying here. And so that phrase of the people of God and the church, the church needs to be. We have to understand that we're not like just staying inside. The goal is not for us to stay inside our four walls and be like, hey, if you want to get free, if you want to get saved, if you want to get touched, if you want to get transformed, you got to come in here. You've got to come in, and then we're gonna give it to you, right? we're blessed to be broken and given to the world. In other words, we have strategic responsibility. I think we have strategic opportunity that God gives to us to impact our community, to impact our society, whether it's like the one person on the street corner that you have an opportunity to talk to, or the person you talk to in the line for coffee, or maybe in a larger capacity, whatever it is, whatever it looks like, however it's expressed. But to stop looking at this thing as the church is this place where it's kind of, in many cases, and just speaking in generalities, it's not across the board, but in
Yeah.
many cases we have kind of like a religious club, and the only way that people are going to hear the good news is if they come in. And it's great when they come in and hear the good news. It's great. But that's not where most people live. Most people live in life, in community, in society. And God has sent us out into this world as ambassadors of his world to disciple. And not all discipleship takes place inside the four walls of the church. It just doesn't. And I think we need to learn that. And so, anyway, would you kind of elaborate on that statement there, on, rather than just our perspective being you got to come to church, like, no, let's be the church in the world as God has sent us out into the world?
I mean, I think that sentence is a sort of an allusion to communion. That on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and
Yeah.
broke it, gave it to his disciples, and said, "Eat this. This is my body, which is broken for you." So he blesses the bread. He breaks the bread as a symbol of, the incarnation, the cross, and then he gives it to them. He says, "Eat it to remember me." And then it's in that section from Paul where he says, whenever you do this, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That somehow there's even mission in communion, like somehow the blessing of the bread, the breaking of the bread, and the distribution into the world. And this is the body of Christ. The body of Christ is meant to be broken, blessed, broken, and given to the world. Of course, that's true for, the cross, the work of the cross, but it's also probably true for the incarnated church. Like we are his body, supposedly, and so we are blessed, and we are also broken, and we are meant to be given away to the world, like sent out into the world. So yeah, I think you said it perfectly well. It's probably, I don't know, a conversion that we all have to go through. Not just a conversion to Jesus, to believe in Jesus, but a conversion to actually love the world, to be sent somehow. Like that.
That's good.
That transition between a disciple and an apostle. Like where they're called. So when Jesus calls the disciples, I'm pretty sure that the transaction was, "Come and follow me." Like, you get to be my student, and they're all like, "Yeah, dude, that sounds amazing." Like, we've heard all about you. You are the real deal. And then to be his student, to walk around with him and to see what he did and what he said and just how he carried himself, and this, like, the authority that he walked in, it must have been like, dude, we made the right choice, But then there's a moment, even in the gospel narratives, where they stop being called disciples and they start being called apostles. The 12 disciples become, I don't know when and how exactly, but they become the 12 apostles, right? And then in the birth of the church, which is that's the era we're in, is that we're meant to be apostles. So we make disciples, but disciples are meant to become apostles. And of course, there's nothing mysterious about that word. It's just a Greek rendering of missionary. Latin, missio in Latin is the word to be sent. Apostolo in Greek is the word to be sent. So it's just like, you go from like, I came to you, which is to your point, you come into church to be discipled. But then somewhere along the line, when you're becoming a disciple, you realize, I'm actually supposed to be given to the world. This is the one I follow. This is what he did. So I have to go. I've come to learn that I have to go. And that actually our identity is like changed. Of course, we never stop being a learner. We never stop being a student of Jesus, a disciple. But you begin to understand, actually, I've been sent. I've been sent to the world.
Hmm.
Although you can discover that in a generalized sense, but and maybe this is another direction we could take this conversation. But if you don't know where you are sent, then I would say you're like an unactivated missionary, unactivated apostle. And I think that's another major problem that we have in our time, is that more and more people are agreeing with what we're talking about right now. That of course the church is meant to be missionary, and they even see themselves as a missionary person, but they can't tell you to whom they've been sent, where they're
Mm.
sent, to the people they've been sent. And so effectively they're off the board. They're out of the game. And so
Hmm.
that's where, to me, the idea of calling comes in, clarity on our calling, which would have been that is, to me, that's a very like pivotal, almost the fulcrum of this whole idea of missionary church or microchurches or dispersed church or decentralized church. Right there in the fulcrum of that whole discussion is, but if you can't tell me who you are called to, where you are sent, it doesn't work. It's just an idea.
Yeah.
None of it works if the sort of ordinary disciple Christian person can say, I know exactly who God has sent me to.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, so on that, let's get into some specifics on, first of all, just understanding what microchurch is, what that concept is about, and maybe, I don't know, well, you're the expert here, but but maybe the best way to get into that is to talk a little bit about the underground network and how that was started, and kind of to see what that looks like, because that obviously gives us a very real picture of what microchurch looks like or can look like.
Well, it's interesting because I think microchurch is really the starting point. It's basically this belief that, well, what's the simplest sort of iteration of the church? What's the simplest
Mm.
version or expression of the
Yeah.
church? We say if we the ecclesial minimum, if you stripped away,
Uh-huh.
like, do you need a building? Do you need a parking lot? Do you need money to be a church? And most of us would say, well, no, not really. No, I mean, it'd be nice, but no.
Yeah.
And then whatever you get down, do you need leadership? Do you need a pastor to be a church?
Mm.
Do you need elders to be a church? Like, you keep asking the question until you get to your minimum. Now, yours might be different than mine. A listener maybe have their own,
Sure.
but you have an answer to that question. Like the six things or four things or two things or whatever, that if you don't have these things, you're not the church. But if you do, you are. That, to me, is the idea of microchurch. And once you come to that ecclesial minimum, that's simplistic, the business terms, what you call the minimum viable product. Once you know what
Mm.
your minimum viable product is, then you start realizing, well, more people could do that than just professional clergy, in big buildings. So for us in the underground, it was this conviction that when worship, like the Lordship of Jesus, community, real relationship with believers, and mission, some way expanding the kingdom of God into like light into darkness somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
when those three things are happening in the same place with the same group of people, you're looking at the church. So that
Mm.
that was it for us. That sort of tripartite definition of the church, and then we said, well, that's pretty small, right? That doesn't need, like, that could be in a laundromat, that could be in a company break room, that can be on a softball field, that can be in a pub,
Mm.
that could be in a school, that could be under a tree, that could be in a house, that could be anywhere, right? That could be on a block. Now it could be much bigger than that, but it could also be really small. So that simple definition of the church then suddenly releases everything. It changes
Mm.
everything about, okay, well, who could lead it? Well, you don't have to go to seminary to do that, out of your living room or your break room or the softball pitch or field or whatever. So all of a sudden now it's the activation of the priesthood of all believers again, which should have been a seminal idea for any Protestant person, but it somehow got
Mm.
lost. And
Right.
and so realizing, okay, fine, then we actually have a lot more churches. We could have a lot more churches than we realize. We could have, even within a small congregation of 300-400 people, you could have 100 microchurches potentially. So then, all right, well, then what should the infrastructure of the church look like to support that? If you really believe that was true and possible, what would it look like to support that? So the underground is really an attempt to answer that question, an
An
attempt to create,
experiment, right?
yes, an experiment
Pretty
in
much.
creating a comprehensive ecclesiological structure for microchurches. So what in kind of whatever 21st century parlance would be networks. Everything is being redistributed. Power is being redistributed in networks. Communication is being redistributed in networks. Technology is being redistributed in networks. And I think the church is being reconceived as network. And so if you think of actually, instead of a congregation, if you think of a network of churches or a network of small microchurches, you need new everything. You need new leadership titles. You need new ways of raising money. You need new ways of using physical plant. You need new expectations for ordination. So the underground, to simplify it, is an attempt to answer all of those questions and to create a structure and approach that works for that starting point. That everyone is called into mission somewhere, and everyone can plant a church. And then what do you do when you have loads of them? How do you network them together? How do you have accountability? How do you have biblical commitment? How do you have covenant? How do you have concern for orthodoxy? How do you look out for abuse and so on? Those are all questions that you have to answer. And so we did. So we tried, and it's far from perfect, and it's an early iteration. I think of like I think of like Netscape Navigator. I don't know if you remember that. You're probably not old enough for
I remember it. Yeah.
One of the first web browsers is like pretty cool. You could get on the web, but like that doesn't exist anymore. And if you looked at it now, you'd be like, this is garbage. But it was an early iteration that we could build on. And all the other web browsers that exist now started there. That's how I see the underground. It's like an attempt to try to take a shot at that. And then people like you who are going to church plant now, smarter people than me, are going to be able to like improve upon that, live in it, figure out its flaws, do it better. But the basic starting proposition is different when you say everybody can plant a church, everyone can have their hands in creating the church somewhere, and that mission is an essential definition of that. So you can't actually be the church if you don't have a sense of where you're sent, if you don't know to whom God has sent you.
I have so many questions.
Sorry, man. Yeah, good.
I have so many questions. No, man. No, it's awesome. I appreciate you sharing. One thing, so just talking about your experience with the underground network, which was birthed in Tampa, right?
Mm-hmm.
And would you say is the majority of it in Tampa, or has it expanded beyond? Because I believe it's even international, right? Is that correct? Or is the underground pretty much specifically in the Tampa area, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so we early on we made the decision that we did not want to franchise or move our name around. So there are a few little sister movements around the world that took our name, but we've since changed our mind about that and thought no. Actually, part of what it would mean to be underground is you have to be your own thing. There is no like context is everything. So we just don't have the capacity. We're not big enough. We're not smart enough to preside over some sort of empire and audit it all. So instead, what we thought was, it's an idea. It belongs to the people of God. I had this thought, Duke, early on, because I had the kind of first 10, 12 years of my professional life was connected to the university. So I have this idea, like in academics, where you have a hypothesis or a thesis, you go test that, you do some research, you go into a laboratory, you experiment, and then you get some findings. Like maybe your thesis is proved true, maybe it's proved false, your hypothesis is true, it's false, it's partly true, whatever, and then you publish those results, right? So that was what the underground was. It was essentially, I thought, and early on I said, we're going to take 10 years here, we're going to take a decade, we're going to try out our ideas, this hypothesis. And then at the end of that 10 years, we're going to report on that research. So I wrote a book in 2017 called Underground Church, which is essentially that report, which what I thought was like, okay, this belongs to the academy. Like, this information belongs to the people of God, the church, to know where we blew it, where our ideas were good, where they were not good, where they were mediocre, in between. It's like we pulled away from the church for a decade to just do something different, but then came back into the kind of broader church by saying, okay, here's what we discovered, here's what we found out. And I think, to me, that's been a part of it too, is just sharing our story with the world. And then I'll tell you what happens. One, some people go, that's amazing, I want to try that. But more often than not, what happens is people go, that's what I already think. They'll say,
Right.
that's what I've been
Right.
doing. That's what I've been
Yeah.
thinking. So I meet people in Austria or Singapore or New
Hmm.
Zealand or Nepal or Denmark, and I'm not saying this hypothetically, I'm telling you this. It's like everywhere I go, I
Yeah.
meet people that go, that's what we were saying,
Hmm.
and maybe we're a few steps ahead, or maybe we've codified the language a little bit better. And so there's a like an immediate recognition, which of course that's just prophetic. That means that God is trying to speak to his people at the same time saying the same thing. So
Right.
we're
Right.
not we're not inventing something, right? We're just trying to hear the same thing, trying to hear the same God speak to us. And so what has happened with the underground is we just create these relationships. So we have friendships with people all over the world that said that's what we want too. That's what we're trying to do. And so there's no franchise to buy. There's just relationship to have, and learning to share. And it is a pretty awesome. I mean, there's probably 100 cities around the world that are related to us in some way, and that's been pretty
Hmm.
amazing. And who wants to control anyway? The folly of control, that you would create something in order to control it, is just it's just a poisonous idea. And actually, it's like if my sons or my daughters wanted to go into church ministry, and they said, I want to build some big empire, I would just say, you should not go into ministry at all. I just think it's a dangerous
Yeah.
game.
Right.
Control's a
Right.
dangerous game for you. Like it's gonna ruin you, actually.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact it's probably not great for others. But anyway.
Yeah. No, and I resonate with that as well. What you were saying there about people all around the world, like, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's like as I'm reading the book or you're reading your books. I'm actually reading a couple of your books at the same time. Kind of reading them and seeing the concepts here. I'm like, like this is a lot of this stuff is so in line with my thoughts. I've given a lot of thought to this, and just the way that we do church, and my goal is always to be like to find what's actually effective, what's actually going to be effective. And for me, I don't know, I've just been rethinking a lot of things. I grew up in the youth groups and stuff like that, and we'd go to these youth conferences, and I loved them. Like these, kind of big stadium type situations. This is just an example, and I loved it. My life was always impacted, but usually my life would be impacted for that week or the next couple weeks, and then I would kind of settle back into the way things were before. I know that not everybody has that story. Some people get impacted by an event or something like that, and then their life is totally different, and they're whatever. But what I would find is, I feel like a lot of, let me say it like this: I feel like a lot of what we do in the church is like highs and lows. Like we do something, we do an event, or we do something to kind of create some kind of momentum that, I don't know, like I just wonder, I'm trying to rethink a lot of things about the way that we do church and the way that we build community and the way that we are really impacting the lives of people, the lives of the people that are coming in, and the lives of the people that are around us in our neighborhoods and our communities and our cities. And how can we really be as impactful as possible, where we're not just creating good vibes and putting band-aids on things, but we're actually making a true lasting impact. And the way that you describe, the micro church, it's so missional focused that there's real, like, what you're doing, what you're about. And I think that we can just very easily get lost in a large, church setting, or even a smaller church setting, but where there's not a clearly defined mission or clearly defined focus. And so what I'm wondering is, because as I'm reading your book, and I don't want to misrepresent what you're anything, so correct me if you think that my thinking's off base, but it seems to me that at least to an extent we should be able to take the principles that you're discussing in the microchurch concept and maybe apply them to even like a larger community. I don't know if that's possible. I guess what I'm wondering is microchurch scalable, or will we inevitably lose something in the process if we, let's say we start small. And this is kind of a multi-pronged question. My first question: if we're starting small, just for you and for your experience so far with in the past with the underground, how big do you allow things to grow? Do you allow them to evolve, naturally, or does there come a point where you're like, okay, this is this is the limit. Let's kind of break this off and start a community somewhere else, or do you let it just kind of keep growing organically, or does it depend on the situation? And then I guess the sort of follow-up question to that is, if that's the case and we allow these communities to continue to grow, how do we continue to maintain that missional focus and community aspect as we are scaling up in terms of numbers? Took me a long time to get to the question, but
No, yeah, it's great. I mean, there's a
yeah.
lot of, obviously that's thoughtful. Yeah, of course, microchurches are scalable. In fact, well, and I make the argument in the book Microchurches that the majority of churches in the world for all time were less than 100 people. So if you just talk
Yes.
statistics, like if you're like an alien and you looked down at the earth and said, "What's a church and how big is it?" It's less than 100 people. Like that's how the church organizes itself. So because we have examples that are outliers, statistical outliers, are very big, and 1,000 people to 10,000 people iterations of the church, and because all those are the ones that get all the attention, those are the ones that read all the books, those are the ones that
Right.
we've come to believe that actually the smaller version of the church is something's wrong with it, like something like inferior or something, a little Napoleon complex or something going around saying we need to do better, we need to
Wow.
reach people more or something. But if you really believed in the sovereignty of God, like God is not impotent in the construction and distribution of his church for the last 2 millennia. So pull back for a second and say, we just haven't done a total rubbish job at this. It's all our fault. God's up there shaking his head, looking at the angels going, God, I gave them this church idea and they really screwed it up,
Yeah.
Um,
Really ran that into the ground, guys.
yeah, boy, geez, what a disappointment they are, If we believe that he's like a player, in the construction, then you pull back for a second. Say, okay, well then what are we looking at? If we're looking at all these just little 70-person, 50-person things all over the world, all over time, then you suddenly start to see the strength of it. Actually, you start to see well, in biology, what's called a superorganism. Like superorganisms are like cities or ant colonies or something. They just can't be destroyed. Like it's very hard to destroy a city. Like you can blow up one section of it or kill the waterworks. It just finds a way to heal itself. It finds a way to fix itself. Because it's a lot of little independent agents.
Yeah.
That aren't really controlled by anything, but they sort of work together in an ecosystem. And if you think of the church like that, you start to realize, oh my gosh, this is probably the most powerful social organization in the history of humanity. Like it's the most resilient, powerful
Adaptable.
thing.
Yeah.
Adaptable.
Yeah.
Like it can go anywhere. It can speak any language. It can approach
Wow.
any kind of person. It can be like a biker club or a Papua New Guinea tribe or a
Right.
set of Wall Street bankers. Like you can have a church anywhere with
Yeah.
any kind of people, and it finds a way to sort of contextualize itself. And Jesus, now there's lots of messed up stuff and a lot of perversion of truth and whatever, but you also see like a thread of orthodoxy in every context, every place, every people, every tongue, every tribe, every language. So Is it scalable? Absolutely, as long as we're not trying to control it. And I think one of the challenges for the American sensibility in terms of church planting is like, yeah, I want to plant a bunch of these things, and then I want to put them, I want to brand them, I want to own them somehow, and see it as
Mm,
this growing thing I'm building,
right.
with
Right.
all of
Yeah.
these entities. Now that becomes problematic and challenging, and there are limits to that. There's limits to whether you can do that, whether you even should do that. But the microchurch as a concept is really just trusting that, like when Jesus comes into the life of a person, and they have his voice and scripture and good discipleship, that they're eventually their heart is gonna grow for some people. He's gonna send them to those people, the gospel we share with those people, and the church can be formed then in the soil of that place, that mission, those people, and it can find its own voice. In fact, I've made the argument that a lot of like schisms and church division and stuff like that, which we have seen as a sign of our ineptitude and a sign of our sin, which it kind of is. I mean, I'm not denying that, that schisms and church splits and stuff aren't full of sin and
Sure.
stupidity and brokenness. But again, take a step back,
Right.
and every time the church is sort of split, what you see is contextualization. What you see is like it
Mm,
becomes a little more, makes a little more sense to a certain group of people, makes a little more sense to a certain group of people. So kind of like Paul and Barnabas disagreeing about John Mark, and
yeah.
deciding to go on two different missionary journeys, where Barnabas takes John Mark and he goes through, you know, he goes back through their hometown, and then Paul goes north and he takes
Yeah.
Silas.
Good
So
point.
it opens up mission, the little breakdown, which is not great. I get it. And to be a part of it is painful. Uh,
Absolutely.
but actually, God is just fine through all of that. And the church continues to be the church. So are these things scalable? You bet. In fact, there may not be anything more scalable in terms of what we do with church right now, as long as you'll let it be a kingdom thing, as long as it isn't, it has to be our thing or branded by our thing. So if you go plant a church
Yeah.
and you say yes to people, some of them will stay loyal to you, to your little, uh, shingle you hang out, but some of them won't. And if you die to that, if you'll say, I love that, I love that people just go off and start new
Wow.
things,
Wow.
then you're going to be happy, and the kingdom will grow around you. And that to me is probably a better uh, vision for the church anyway.
Wow. Yeah, it's kind of like, well, it's not, but it reminded me of something that Paul said in Philippians chapter 1, where he's like, even if, even in some cases, Christ is preached from envy, from strife, like there's this motivation that's wrong. But he says, I rejoice in the fact that Christ is preached, that the gospel is being preached. And so I think that if we could learn how to, and this is coming from Paul, who's an overseer of many different church communities, and he's a apostle and missionary, as you're talking there, in a very, kind of like the upper echelon of what that would look like, traveling to the different cities, visiting the different churches, writing letters, instructing them, all of that. And he's like, you know what? I'm actually content in the fact that even if there's some things that are happening from a wrong motivation, that Christ is still being preached, and he's finding a way to rejoice in that. And I think that that only comes from what you're saying there, being able to kind of loosely hold something that the Lord has given you to steward, right? Not to control, but to steward, and to really allow him to be the head of the church, like who he is.
That's it.
He's the head of all
That's
of
it.
it, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, none of us have ever done any ministry that wasn't a little bit messed up and bad motivations. And
Yeah.
so this whole idea that like, oh yeah, those people left on bad terms, it's like, I mean, yeah, I of course.
Right.
And just like we everything we do is messed up too to some degree.
Yeah.
So we're broken, and God uses that. It's just not. And again, I'm not saying that in a micro level it's not a problem, and they're not. It's not full of problems and full of things that require repentance. But what I'm saying is God is
Mm,
strong enough and sovereign enough that when those things are happening, he's not losing his mind up there. He's not going, oh no, the whole plan is now foiled by this schism that's happening in such and such church. that will spin off. I mean, we've had loads of people leave the
Yeah.
underground angry, mad about something, frustrated about something, disagreeing about something. But there they are, a few years later, still doing mission, still loving people, reaching out to people. So to me, I'm like, that's who cares? I mean, that's awesome. Now, it still hurts to have
Yeah.
broken relationship, of
Sure.
course,
Sure.
but the
Sure.
church moves on. The like true disciples will keep being like at the disposal of Jesus in the field of mission, even if they're frustrated and have to move on from a certain community into another community. That's all okay. And if we're more
Yeah.
open-handed, we'd probably just be healthier anyway. Just
Come
let
on.
people do what they need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, because if I'm trying to build something in my own strength, right, and I'm trying to be in control of everything, then any growth that I receive, it then really becomes my responsibility to try to maintain that. And it becomes
Good
very
point.
stressful and people
That's it.
burn out. It's, we do that to ourselves. We take on stress, I think, in different ways than what God wants for us. And he wants us to remember that his yoke is easy, his burden is light. And so if he's called us into something, then he doesn't want us bogged down by the stress of trying to build the thing that he's called us to, recognizing that, you know what, this never belonged to me in the first place. This belongs to
That's
you.
it.
I'm going to
Yeah.
listen. I'm going to be obedient, and I'm going to steward well what you've given to me, to be a part of, to be a leader of, or whatever. But ultimately, like, the buck stops with him, not with me. And so I think what you're saying is so beautiful. We can really experience rest in everything that we do, whether we're talking about churches, businesses, whatever it is that God has called us to build,
That's it.
or to be a part of. Then yeah, we can find so much more peace and rest by allowing him to just do what he does so well, and we follow, his leading.
Amen.
So, well, brother, I want to be respectful of your time. So many more things I want to talk to you about, but maybe we could do it again if you're down for it. But
Yeah.
thank you for being here. And just before we wrap it up, man, if you would, where would you point people to so that they can find your books and anything else that you'd like to, yeah, resources, things like that.
I'm pretty underground these days. But of course, Amazon is a great place to buy books. So there's all my
Sure.
books are there, and of course, I'd love for people to be provoked by the stuff I've written. But I'm pretty sort of out of the public eye these days. It's funny, maybe even just as a closing thought, Duke, as we just talked about all that control and leadership and power and whatever. It's like, was it Shakespeare? Heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Mm,
Like, I think we need more leaders. I think we need more churches, but we probably need to renegotiate what we mean by leadership and what leadership is, so
yeah.
that it doesn't kill us, it doesn't break us.
Yeah.
And that's probably part of my journey too, is like, I think a journey towards obscurity and towards quiet. I still want to be busy, and I still want to be fighting the devil, and I am. But that journey towards publicness and being known and that kind of stuff is probably something we have to navigate very carefully, um,
Mm.
and watch your soul, and don't crave too much of it, and power itself. Be careful. So if we keep things small, back to that idea, it not only is it like possibly the best way to deliver the church to the world, and the sacramental life that the church offers to the world, but it probably is like the most joyful way to live as a leader, to be a part of
Mm.
something that just lets go and stays small, stays obscure. So yeah, by all means, read one of my books if you can, but you probably won't find me, although I am on social media occasionally and stuff like that, so I'm not afraid of it.
I tracked you down
You did.
one
You
way or
did great.
another
And I
somehow.
like this. I like meeting you. I like the occasional conversation. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again for your time, man. It's again privileged to meet you and know you, and thanks for sharing. You added a tremendous amount of value to me personally, and I've gleaned a lot from your writing, and even probably more so from having an opportunity to chat with you a little bit today. So thanks so much.
Thanks, dude.
All right, thanks everybody. Come back for a future episode. Love you guys.